Everyone remembers South Park as the show that mocked gay people for cheap laughs, crude jokes, shock value, nothing serious underneath any of it. The people handing out television's biggest awards in 1998 looked at those exact same episodes and saw something nobody watching at home did. In this video, we break down every one of South Park's gayest moments. The gay dog that broke the show open, Big Gay Al's big gay boat ride, a dog circles another dog at a bus stop in a small Colorado mountain town, and every kid standing there expects a fight. What happens instead sends one 8-year-old boy into a quiet personal crisis, costs his town a football game, and hands an animated series only 4 episodes old, the first serious award nomination of its life. The episode is called Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride. It first aired on Comedy Central on September 3rd, 1997, written by Trey Parker and Matt Stone with Parker directing. To understand how strange that moment was at the time, it helps to remember where the show actually stood in September of 1997. South Park had premiered less than a month earlier, with an episode about Cartman being abducted by aliens. 3 episodes had aired. The reputation forming around the series in those first few weeks was built almost entirely on shock, on children swearing, on a small boy dying horribly every single week. Reviewers were still deciding whether the whole thing counted as television or just as a rude cartoon that had gotten lucky. Nobody watching those first 3 weeks had any reason to expect the 4th episode to be a fairly gentle argument about accepting people for who they are. The setup is simple enough. Stan Marsh has a new dog named Sparky, and Stan spends the morning at the bus stop insisting Sparky is the toughest dog in South Park. Cartman disagrees and puts forward a rival dog named Sylvester. The two animals size each other up the way dogs do before a fight, and then Sparky climbs on top of Sylvester and starts humping him, sending the other dog running off yelping. Cartman announces to everyone standing there that Sparky is gay. The joke lands in about 4 seconds, and then the episode does something almost nobody expected. It stops treating the reveal as a punchline and starts treating it as a problem Stan cannot solve. Running underneath all of this is the biggest football game of the year, a homecoming matchup against neighboring Middle Park. Stan's Uncle Jimbo and his friend Ned show up at practice, less interested in whether the boys win than in whether they can beat a 70-point spread, since the two of them have money riding on the outcome. Chef is coaching, the whole town is invested, and Stan, the one player anybody is counting on, spends the entire week unable to concentrate on anything except his dog. Stan tries to fix Sparky. He talks to him, he tries to teach him, he drags him around town looking for something that will make the situation go away. The turning point comes when Sparky finally has enough of being treated like a broken thing and simply leaves, wandering off into the woods outside town. Stan goes after him, and that search is what pulls him out of South Park entirely and into the part of the episode that gave it its title. What Stan finds out in the woods is a large house run by a man who introduces himself as Big Gay Al, and the house is a sanctuary. Big Gay Al takes in gay animals that have been rejected by their owners, and the place is full of them, every species imaginable, all living together perfectly happily. Sparky is already there. Big Gay Al is delighted to meet Stan, delighted to meet anyone, and answers every single question about how he is doing by announcing that he is super, thanks for asking. The character is drawn and voiced as broadly as it is possible to draw and voice a character, all pastel colors and theatrical gestures and enormous cheerfulness, and that broadness is exactly the point the episode is building toward, because Big Gay Al does not lecture Stan, he offers him a ride. The Big Gay Boat Ride is a small indoor attraction, the kind of slow-moving dark ride found in a theme park, and it carries Stan through a series of dioramas laying out the history of how gay people have been treated across the centuries. Ancient civilizations, persecution, wars, long stretches of hiding. The tone of the whole sequence is calm and matter-of-fact, delivered in the same relentlessly upbeat voice Big Gay Al uses for everything else. And the contrast between how cheerful the narration sounds and how bleak the actual history looks is where the sequence gets its weight. Stan gets off that ride understanding something he did not understand before, and he takes it straight back to town. The football game has already gone badly. Jimbo and Ned's bet is in ruins. And Stan, standing in front of the entire town, tells them plainly that Sparky is gay, that there is nothing wrong with that, and that the problem was never the dog. Mr. Garrison, the boys' teacher, has spent the episode voicing some of the ugliest opinions in it, which is worth holding on to because of where that character eventually goes. Chef gets called out too, on the grounds that a man who has spent his whole life on the receiving end of prejudice should recognize it faster than anyone else in the room. The episode ends without any of the cruelty the show had built its early reputation on. Sparky comes home. Big Gay Al gets to keep his sanctuary. Nobody is punished for a joke. For a series that had spent 3 weeks establishing that it would go anywhere and say anything, the 4th episode quietly established the other half of the formula, the part that turned out to matter far more over the following decades. South Park would say the unsayable thing, and then it would take the unsayable thing seriously. The reaction to that choice arrived faster than anyone at the show expected. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in 1998 in the Outstanding Animated Program category for programming less than 1 hour. It lost that year to a Simpsons episode called Trash of the Titans. There is a coincidence sitting underneath that result, since The Simpsons had won the same Emmy the previous year for Homer's Phobia, an episode built around Homer's discomfort with a gay character. Two of the most talked about animated comedies in America had, within roughly a year of each other, sent an episode about homophobia to the Emmys. The Emmy nomination was not the only recognition. The episode was also nominated in the Outstanding Individual Episode category at the 1998 GLAAD Media Awards, handed out by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. That detail is the one that tends to surprise people most, because it puts a formal nomination from a gay advocacy organization on a show that had been on the air for 4 weeks and was already being described in newspapers as the most offensive thing on television. Beyond that, this was also the episode submitted when South Park won the Cable Ace Award for Animated Series in 1997, the final year those awards were ever given out. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have both pointed to this episode as their favorite from the first season, and their reasoning has less to do with the jokes than with the timing. The show needed to prove early that it was capable of more than shock, and this was the episode that proved it. It gave critics who were inclined to dismiss the series something concrete to point at, and it gave Comedy Central a defense that held up for years afterward whenever a new controversy landed. One piece of the episode has confused people ever since it aired. George Clooney guest starred as Sparky. Clooney, who was one of the biggest television stars in America at the time, thanks to his run on a hospital drama, was billed as a guest voice on an animated comedy in its first season, and the entire role consists of barking. He has no dialogue at all. Clooney was an early and vocal supporter of the show, having reportedly helped spread the original animated short that led to the series, and taking a wordless role as a gay dog was apparently his idea of a favor. He would eventually get an actual line of dialogue out of the franchise, but not until the movie 2 years later, and not as Sparky. It also helps to put September of 1997 in context, because the ground the episode was standing on was less settled than it looks from a distance. Only 5 months earlier, in April of 1997, Ellen DeGeneres had come out on her own sitcom in an episode that became a national news story for weeks, drew boycott threats from advertisers, and effectively ended the show not long afterward. Will and Grace, the series most people credit with making a gay lead character routine on network television, would not premiere until September of the following year. So when South Park sent a 4th grader on a slow-moving educational ride through the history of gay persecution, it was doing it in a television landscape where the subject was still treated by most networks as a risk to be managed rather than a story to be told. The design of Big Gay Al carries a lot of the episode's weight. He is drawn in soft pinks and purples, moves with enormous theatrical sweep, and speaks in a voice pitched somewhere between a cruise director and a children's television host. Every single visual choice about him leans into the most exaggerated version of the stereotype available. A show trying to be careful would have made him ordinary. South Park made him the loudest possible version of himself, and then made him the only adult in the entire episode, with a clear head, a stable home, and a coherent set of values. The stereotype gets used as the delivery system for the argument rather than as the argument itself, and that decision is repeated across almost every gay character the show introduced afterward. Chef's role in the episode adds another layer that often gets lost. He is the one adult Stan can actually talk to, and his advice throughout is practical and not moral, delivered in the same easygoing way he handles everything else. When the town's reaction turns ugly, Chef gets singled out specifically on the reasoning that a black man in a small Colorado town has spent his life close enough to prejudice to recognize the shape of it immediately. That beat is short and it is never underlined, but it establishes something about how this show handles bigotry that holds across almost 30 years of episodes. Nobody in South Park gets to be automatically innocent because of the group they belong to. The boat ride sequence itself deserves a closer look too, because of how much information it moves in how little time. Stan is carried past a series of small tableaus, each one representing a different era, and the narration keeps a steady, sunny tone through all of it, including the stretches where what is being depicted is straightforwardly grim. There is no music cue telling the audience to feel sad. There is no pause for reflection. The whole thing is delivered at theme park pace, and then it ends, and Stan gets off the boat, and the episode moves on. The lightness of the delivery is doing all the work, and a heavier hand at any point in that sequence would have collapsed it. What that single episode left behind reaches much further than one football game and one runaway dog. Big Gay Al survived, which very few one-off characters on this show ever do. He came back as a scoutmaster, as a wedding participant, as a community leader, and as the voice of the gay population of South Park whenever the town needed one. The template established here also survived, and it is the template almost every episode covered from this point forward is built on. The method is is to take the most inflammatory possible framing of a subject, put it on screen without softening it, and then let the actual argument of the episode land somewhere far more reasonable than the framing suggested. Nothing about that approach ever stopped being risky. Some of the episodes built on it landed cleanly and picked up awards. Others triggered public condemnation from the exact organizations that had nominated this one. But the shape of the thing was set here, in September of 1997, on a show that had been on the air for less than a month, in an episode about a boy who could not accept his dog. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One character in that episode spent the whole runtime saying the ugliest things anybody said out loud, and the show let him say them. He was not written as a villain, and he was not written as a joke about bigots. He was written as something much stranger, and it would take 4 full seasons and a nervous breakdown in the mountains before the audience found out what. Section 2. 4 seasons in the closet. Mr. Hat, the novel, and the Tree of Insight. In the very first episode of South Park, before the aliens, before Kenny dies, before anything else happens, a 3rd grade teacher walks to the front of a classroom with a puppet on his right hand and lets the puppet do the talking. The teacher is Herbert Garrison. The puppet is Mr. Hat. And that arrangement, one man saying the things he cannot say himself by putting them in the mouth of a piece of felt, turned into the longest and strangest character arc in the history of the show. Garrison debuted in Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which aired on August 13th, 1997, and he has been voiced by Trey Parker from that day forward. The character came from 2 real places. Parker's own kindergarten teacher used a hand puppet in class, and that puppet was also named Mr. Hat. The rest of Garrison, the sourness and the strange authority and the willingness to say wildly unhinged things to small children with complete confidence, came partly from a British literature professor Parker had while studying at the University of Colorado. 2 ordinary sources combined into one of the least ordinary teachers in television. What makes the early version of the character work is how strictly the puppet rule is enforced. Mr. Hat is not a teaching aid. Mr. Hat is a permission structure. When Garrison wants to insult a student, threaten a student, or express an opinion he knows he should keep to himself, the puppet says it. When Garrison is asked directly about the puppet, he treats Mr. Hat as a separate person with separate opinions and gets defensive on the puppet's behalf. Over the first few seasons, the show plays this as a running absurdity, and the audience is invited to laugh at a grown man arguing with his own hand. Sitting underneath that absurdity, though, is a very specific idea. There is an entire second personality inside Garrison that only gets to exist when he can pretend it belongs to someone else. Alongside that, the early seasons stack up a mountain of evidence about who Garrison actually is, and then have him deny all of it at the top of his lungs. In the 4th episode of the first season, when the town is arguing about Stan's dog, Garrison is the loudest voice on the wrong side, delivering some of the ugliest lines anyone in the episode delivers. The show does not present this as hypocrisy the audience is supposed to figure out slowly. Other characters call it out directly and immediately. Everyone in South Park seems to know, and Garrison seems to be the only person in Colorado who does not. The show named the mechanism out loud earlier than most people remember. In the season 2 episode Summer Sucks, Garrison ends up in a therapy session with Dr. Katz, a character borrowed from another Comedy Central animated series of the era. Katz listens to Garrison talk about the puppet, then offers the obvious professional reading, which is that Mr. Hat is a physical stand-in for the part of Garrison he refuses to acknowledge. Garrison rejects this flatly, and then, before Katz can push back or defend the point, the therapist is killed by an enormous novelty firework. The joke is doing 2 things at once. It is the standard South Park move of destroying a character mid-scene for laughs, and it is a very precise gag about how conversations like that one actually go. The moment somebody gets close to naming the thing, the conversation ends, and Garrison walks away exactly as he was. By the 4th season, the pressure had built to the point where the character could not carry on as he was. Garrison takes time away from teaching, and during that stretch he writes a novel. The book is called In the Valley of Penises. He writes it, by his own account, as a straightforward heterosexual romance. It sells respectably. Then it wins the Gay Pulitzer Prize, and gets described as the finest piece of homoerotic literature since Huckleberry Finn, and Garrison finds himself publicly celebrated for something he insists he did not do. The book first turns up in a season 4 episode called Cherokee Hair Tampons, and the award and the fallout get referenced afterward. That is the point where the character breaks. Garrison has a nervous breakdown, leaves South Park entirely, and goes to live alone in the mountains above town. It is a strange turn for a comedy to take with a supporting character. He is not written out. He is not killed. He is not quietly dropped between seasons. He is shown having a complete collapse and removing himself from society, and the show simply leaves him up there while it gets on with other stories. The resolution comes in the 11th episode of season 4, called 4th Grade, which first aired on November 8, 2000, and was written by Trey Parker. The main plot of that episode is about the boys starting 4th grade, hating their new teacher, and trying to build build a time machine with the help of 2 Star Trek fans in order to get back to 3rd grade. That transition is the reason the episode gets remembered at all in most discussions of the series, since the boys have stayed in the 4th grade ever since. But the far more consequential story is happening on a mountainside. Miss Choksondik, the new teacher, cannot control the class. Every attempt she makes fails. Desperate for advice, she goes looking for the man who taught these same children the year before, and she finds him living in the wilderness in a state that can only be described as feral. Garrison agrees to help her, and the help he offers takes the form of a ritual. He directs her to something he calls the Tree of Insight, telling her that inside it, she will find what she needs. Choksondik goes in. Nothing happens. She encounters nothing at all, comes back out, and gets on with her life. Then Garrison goes in himself. Inside the tree, he meets a physical version of his own gay side, and that version does not argue with him or shame him. It simply tells him to stop lying. And after 4 seasons of puppets and denials and rage aimed at everybody else, Garrison agrees. He comes down off the mountain, walks back into South Park Elementary, and tells the staff plainly that he is gay. What happens next is the reason this episode belongs in any honest account of the subject. The staff congratulate him. They tell him they are proud of him for accepting himself. It is warm, and it is sincere, and it lasts about 10 seconds, because Garrison then asks for his old teaching job back, and the same people who just applauded him inform him, without a trace of embarrassment, that the school does not hire gay people, and they laugh at him. That ending does something almost no sitcom coming out story had done up to that point. The standard shape of these stories is that the difficulty lives inside the person, and once the person accepts themselves, the difficulty resolves. 4th grade agrees with the first half and then flatly refuses the second half. Garrison does the work. He wins the internal fight that took him 4 years and a mental breakdown to win, and the reward for winning is finding out that the internal fight was never the actual obstacle. The people who were happy to celebrate his self-acceptance in the abstract were not willing to give him a classroom. He does eventually return to the school, but as the kindergarten teacher, several rungs below where he started. The aftermath of that decision reshaped the character permanently and reshaped his relationship with the puppet. Mr. Hat survived the coming out for a while, and Garrison kept using him while teaching kindergarten. But Mr. Hat was largely retired by the 6th season, replaced by a very different kind of teaching assistant, and Parker and Stone have talked about that removal as meaning something beyond one character's props. In their telling, letting go of Mr. Hat lined up with the show letting go of its earlier, more surreal style in favor of the real-world satire it became known for afterward. A talking hand puppet with its own opinions belonged to the version of South Park where Christmas Pooh sang songs, and the show was mostly interested in being weird. The version that came next wanted to argue with the news. Mr. Hat did come back, once, in a way that underlined how much weight the character carried. During the climax of the episode numbered 200, Cartman demands to speak to Mr. Hat specifically, and the puppet returns for the occasion. In a show that has thrown away hundreds of characters without ceremony, saving a felt puppet for a milestone episode is a fairly clear statement about how central he had been. There is a reason the puppet works as well as it does, and it has to do with what a hand puppet lets a writer get away with. A character who says something terrible is responsible for it. A character who has a puppet say something terrible has built himself a small legal defense that everyone in the room can see through and nobody bothers to challenge. The kids in Garrison's class accept the arrangement completely. They talk to Mr. Hat, they answer Mr. Hat's questions. When Mr. Hat insults them, they take the insult from Mr. Hat and not from the man whose hand is inside him. An entire classroom of children has agreed, without discussing it, to participate in a grown man's coping mechanism, and the show plays that agreement completely straight for years without ever calling attention to how odd it is. The other thing to sit with is how unpleasant Garrison is allowed to be during these years. He is not a sympathetic, closeted man waiting for the audience to root for him. He is petty, vindictive, and openly cruel to children. He plays favorites for no reason. He teaches wildly inappropriate material, and he has a habit of taking his own frustration out on whichever 9-year-old is nearest. The show never asks anybody to excuse that behavior, because he is struggling with something. It simply places the two facts next to each other and leaves them there. He is miserable, and he makes everyone around him miserable, and one of those things is feeding the other without ever being offered as an excuse for it. That refusal to soften him is what keeps the eventual coming out from feeling like a lesson. When 4th grade finally lets him say it, the show does not reward him with a personality transplant. He comes down from the mountain exactly as prickly and self-absorbed as he was when he went up. Nothing about accepting himself makes him kind. It only makes him honest, and the show is careful to treat those as two entirely separate achievements. Plenty of television at the time treated a character's coming out as a moment of moral improvement, a sign that the person had grown. South Park treated it as a factual correction to a piece of information the character had been getting wrong about himself, with no bonus attached. There is also something worth noticing about who gets to be right in this story. The audience spends 4 seasons ahead of Garrison, along with essentially every other character character in town. Nobody in South Park is surprised. The staff are not surprised. The children are not surprised. The therapist worked it out in a single session. The only person in the entire fictional world who did not already know was the one person it applied to, and the show is far more interested in that gap than in the reveal itself. The comedy comes out of the enormous amount of energy one person will spend defending a secret that everybody around him has already stopped keeping. What this stretch of the show left behind is the foundation, everything after it stands on. Between 1997 and 2000, South Park built a character who was homophobic in public and gay in private, gave him 4 years of denial, put the psychological explanation in the mouth of a visiting therapist, and then killed that therapist mid-sentence, pushed him into a breakdown, sent him up a mountain, walked him through a hallucinated conversation with himself, brought him back down, and then had the institution he worked for humiliate him for the exact honesty it had just praised. That is a substantial amount of narrative machinery for a cartoon that most people at the time were describing as a show about kids saying bad words. It also set the terms for everything that followed. Garrison would go on to become the character South Park routed almost every conversation about sexuality and identity through, for better and for considerably worse, across more than 2 decades of episodes. Every major swing the show took on this subject after 2000 involved him somewhere. The mountain and the tree were the hinge. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Garrison was still living alone in the woods, refusing to say the word out loud, the rest of the cast had already gone somewhere far stranger. A year earlier, the entire town had been dragged onto movie screens across the country, and the most talked about relationship in that film belonged to nobody living in South Park at all. It was happening several thousand feet underground. Section 3. The worst relationship in hell. Satan and Saddam in Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. 2 characters sit together in a cave below the earth, and one of them is trying to have a serious conversation about the relationship while the other one keeps changing the subject. One of them is the literal devil, the other one is Saddam Hussein, who arrived in hell after being killed by a pack of wild boars. This is the emotional center of a feature film that opened in American theaters on June 30th, 1999, and it is played almost entirely straight. South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was directed by Trey Parker, written by Parker, Matt Stone, and Pam Brady, and built as a full musical, with songs written by Parker together with the Broadway composer Mark Shaman. Everything about the production was a gamble. The series was 2 seasons old. The animation style was famously crude, and the plan was to take that show, put it in cinemas, make it a musical in the classic Hollywood sense, with reprises and counterpoint and a full orchestral score, and let it run at feature length with almost no compromises made for a wider audience. The film went through an extended fight over its rating before arriving at an R, and it has been credited by record keepers with an enormous count of profanities for an animated feature, somewhere around 400. What almost nobody expected from that description was that the film's most developed relationship, the one carrying the actual dramatic weight, would be between 2 men, and that the film would treat it with the seriousness of a domestic drama. The setup arrives early. Kenny dies, as Kenny does, and this time the film follows him down. He is refused entry upstairs and lands in hell, where he discovers that the devil is not running the place with any particular enthusiasm. Satan is lonely, sensitive, and quietly miserable. He is also in a relationship with Saddam Hussein, who has been down there for a matter of weeks and has already taken over most of the decision-making. The dynamic between them is drawn with an uncomfortable amount of accuracy. Saddam is loud, dismissive, and constantly performing for whoever else is in the room. He talks over Satan, he belittles him in front of other people, and then, the moment Satan raises it privately, switches instantly into affection, calling him pet names and telling him he is being oversensitive. He is interested in the physical side of the relationship and openly bored by any other part of it. Satan, for his part, keeps asking for the same thing over and over, which is to be treated with a little respect, and keeps accepting an apology that resolves nothing. Satan gets a solo number called Up There, and it is written and performed as a completely sincere Disney-style want song. He stands alone and sings about how badly he wants to live on the surface, in a world where flowers grow and babies laugh, delivered with real longing and a big soaring finish. There is no wink in it. The joke, to the extent there is one, is that the devil is singing the exact song a princess would sing, and the reason it works is that he means every word. Saddam answers it later with a song called I Can Change, and that number is where the film's read on the relationship becomes unmistakable. Saddam sings a promise that he will be better, that he has heard Satan, that things will be different. The commitment inside that song is not actually there. He says he can change, he never says he will. It is a plea designed to end an argument rather than resolve one, and it works exactly as intended because Satan hears it and gives in and goes back to the way things were. Meanwhile, above ground, the film's other main plot is running toward a public execution. The town's parents have gone to war with Canada over a rude film. Terrence and Phillip have been captured, and the execution is scheduled to take place during a USO show staged for the assembled troops, which is where Big Gay Al comes back. His number is called I'm Super, and it sits in the middle of the war preparations like a piece of debris that has drifted in from another film entirely. Big Gay Al takes the stage in a full production number, backed by dancers, and delivers a song that catalogs global disaster in cheerful sing-song fashion. Bombs falling, people dying, children crying, politicians lying, disease, environmental damage, the general collapse of everything. And then, having listed all of it, he asks the audience how they are doing and answers his own question by announcing that he is super. Thanks for asking. It is his catchphrase from the first season, expanded into an entire showstopper, and it is doing something sharper than it first appears. The number is placed immediately before a scene where an audience of soldiers cheerfully watches an execution. The cheerful denial in the song and the cheerful denial in the crowd are the same denial. One detail from that sequence is worth knowing. The pianist accompanying Big Gay Al during the number is an animated version of Mark Scheiman, the film's composer, who is himself openly gay and who wrote the song. He put himself into the number, on screen, playing along. The resolution of the film runs through hell instead of Colorado. Kenny, watching the relationship from the outside, keeps pushing Satan to see it clearly. And in the final act, when Saddam's plan comes apart and he tries the same manipulation one more time, Satan finally refuses. He stands up to him, ends it permanently, and sends him away. And only then does the damage done to the world above get undone. Kenny is rewarded for his part in it and is finally allowed upstairs. The moral climax of a film that spends most of its runtime on swearing, warfare, and fart jokes is a man leaving a partner who treats him badly. It helps to be precise about what the film does and does not do here. It is not a respectful portrayal. Saddam is drawn as a crude photographic cutout. The jokes about the relationship are frequently vulgar, and the sequences are built to make an audience laugh at the two of them constantly. But the structure underneath is the structure of a serious story about an unhealthy relationship with a clear abuser, a clear pattern of behavior, a manipulation song, a partner who keeps forgiving, and an ending where the partner finally stops. In 1999, that story was not commonly told about two men on any screen, let alone in a summer comedy playing in shopping mall cinemas. The film's reception went far beyond what its reputation would suggest. It performed strongly at the box office relative to its budget. Reviewers who had spent 2 years dismissing the series wrote about the musical construction with genuine surprise, since the songs are built with real technique, including a full Act 1 style medley that braids 5 separate storylines together at once. And one of those songs, Blame Canada, went on to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song, giving Parker and Shaman a seat at the ceremony and producing one of the more memorable Oscar performances of that era when Robin Williams sang it live on stage. The award attention landed on the wrong song, in a sense. Blame Canada is the funniest number and the easiest to nominate. Up There and I Can Change are the two doing the real dramatic work, and they are the two that would have to be cut in order to remove the gay relationship from the film. They cannot be cut. The plot does not function without Satan's arc, and Satan's arc does not function without the relationship. A small joke buried in the closing credits says a lot about the confidence of the whole production. Satan and Saddam are both credited as playing themselves. The production history explains some of why the film turned out this way. Development began back during the making of the first season, in January of 1998, which means the movie was being planned at almost the exact moment the series was picking up its first award nominations and its first serious critical attention. The team went into it with a small window and an enormous ambition, and the compressed schedule shows up in the finished product as a kind of recklessness. There was no time to second guess whether the devil should have a want song. Somebody suggested it. It fit the structure, and it went in. The rating fight is part of the story too. The film went back and forth with the ratings board repeatedly, and the version that reached cinemas was the result of a long negotiation about how much could stay. What survived is telling. The material that caused the most trouble was language and imagery, not the relationship in hell, which passed through the process without becoming the central objection. A film could apparently show the devil in a bad relationship with a dictator and receive fewer notes about it than it received about a song title. The scenes between Kenny and Satan are worth watching closely because they are the quietest material in a film with almost no quiet in it. Kenny cannot speak clearly, being permanently muffled, and Satan does most of the talking, which means the relationship advice going in one direction and the mumbled responses coming back the other way create a strange, gentle rhythm that nothing else in the movie has. Satan treats this small dead boy as the only person who has ever listened to him. Given who else is available in hell, he may be right. The staging of I'm Super also deserves a note because of where it sits in the running order. The film has been escalating for an hour by the time it arrives. Two nations are at war, children are being conscripted, an execution is minutes away, and the film stops dead for a full production number in which a man in an outfit covered in feathers dances through a list of everything wrong with the world world while insisting he feels wonderful. Musicals traditionally place a comic number right before the climax to give the audience a breath. This one uses that slot to hold up a mirror to the entire audience of soldiers who are about to applaud a killing, and it does it while smiling. There is a broader point about 1999 hiding in all of this. Mainstream American film that year was not overflowing with gay characters, and the ones that existed were mostly confined to independent releases, supporting roles, or films about coming out. A wide-release studio comedy playing in every mall in the country, containing a flamboyant recurring character with his own musical number and a same-sex couple whose relationship drives the plot, was not a normal thing to find on a summer schedule. The film got away with it partly because nobody expected to find it there, and partly because the surrounding noise about profanity absorbed most of the attention that might otherwise have gone in that direction. The film also contains its own defense, folded into the main plot. The parents of South Park watch a rude Canadian movie, panic, blame the film for their children's behavior, and start a war instead of examining themselves. That is a direct reproduction of the argument being made about South Park itself in newspapers and on cable news at the time, and putting it in the film let Parker and Stone answer their critics inside the thing the critics were complaining about. The same instinct is at work in the material about Satan, which is to put the objection people are most likely to raise on screen in its most extreme possible form, and then build something underneath it that the objection cannot reach. What the film left behind was proof that this material could carry weight. Up to that point, South Park's gay content had lived in single episodes and been resolved within 22 minutes. The movie stretched it across 90, put it at the center of the story instead of the edge, and paired it with an actual musical structure that required the audience to sit with these characters for entire songs. Big Gay Al got his showstopper. Satan got a genuine arc with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that changed him, and the show's writers learned something about how much this particular subject could hold, which they spent the following decade testing considerably harder. They also learned something about consequences. The film generated complaints, political attention, and a great deal of noise, and none of it hurt. If anything, it confirmed that the more directly the show went at this material, the more attention it received, and the less damage the attention caused. That lesson would come back around a few years later, and the results the second time would not be nearly so clean. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years after the film, the show pointed the same subject at a real American institution that was in the middle of a genuine legal fight over exactly this question. The episode did not invent the controversy. It arrived almost exactly 1 year after the Supreme Court had ruled, and it aimed straight at the people who had won. Section 4, the Scoutmaster who won and walked away. Cripple fight. Every boy filing into that meeting hall is expecting a Scoutmaster, and the man who greets them is wearing an immaculate uniform, has clearly been waiting for this all week, and is thrilled to see them. Within about a day, he will be removed from the position, and the reason will have nothing to do with anything he did. The episode is called Cripple Fight. It is the second episode of Season 5 and the 67th of the series overall, and it first aired on June 27, 2001. The date matters more than almost any other detail in this section. On June 28, 2000, almost exactly 1 year before this episode reached air, the Supreme Court of the United States had handed down its decision in Boy Scouts of America against Dale. James Dale was an assistant scoutmaster in New Jersey whose membership had been revoked after a newspaper identified him as gay. He sued. The case went all the way up, and the court ruled by a single vote that the Boy Scouts had a constitutional right of expressive association that would be violated if the organization were forced to keep him. The ruling was enormously divisive. Corporate donors pulled funding, school districts and public bodies cut ties, public figures resigned their honors, and a year later, South Park aired an episode in which a fictional organization called the Mountain Scouts removes a scoutmaster for being gay. Parker and Stone have talked about the Dale ruling as the direct inspiration, and the episode is built as a response to it rather than a summary of it. The plot follows the shape of the real story closely at first. The boys join up. Big Gay Al is their scoutmaster, and he is spectacularly good at the job because scouting is the thing he has loved for his entire life. Some of the parents find out who is leading the troop and immediately object, and the objection they raise is the specific one that had been circulating in the real debate, which is that a gay man around boys is inherently a danger to them. He is removed almost immediately. The show does not treat that removal lightly. Big Gay Al is devastated by it in a way the character has never been shown to be devastated by anything. This is a man whose entire established personality is unshakable good cheer, who has answered every question about his well-being with the same relentlessly upbeat line since 1997, and the episode takes that away from him. He has been in the Scouts since he was a child. It is the one part of his life that had nothing to do with anything anybody argues about, and it is gone because of a rule he had no say in. What follows in the town is a very precise reproduction of what had actually happened in the real world the year before. The story gets picked up, the Mountain Scouts are publicly described as a hate group. Prominent supporters withdraw their backing, including a filmmaker named Steven Spielberg, and that detail was ripped straight from the previous few weeks. The real Steven Spielberg, an Eagle Scout himself, resigned from the Boy Scouts of America Advisory Board in April of 2001, roughly 2 months before this episode aired, saying he had been saddened to watch the organization take a public part in discrimination. The town splits. Everybody involved gets loud. Then the episode does the thing that makes it worth talking about 25 years later. The Mountain Scouts appoint a replacement scoutmaster, a man named Mr. Grazier, who presents exactly as the parents wanted. He is gruff, straightforward, obviously heterosexual, the sort of man nobody thinks twice about. And he is a genuine predator, actively harming the children in his care. The parents removed a man who was good at the job because they had decided his sexuality made him a threat, and they replaced him with someone who was an actual threat, and they did it while congratulating themselves on protecting their kids. That inversion is the sharpest single move in the episode, and the show plays it flat as a straightforward consequence with no punchline attached to it. The parents applied a rule that had nothing to do with behavior, and the rule did exactly what rules that have nothing to do with behavior tend to do, which is catch the wrong person and let the right one through. The boys, meanwhile, decide to fight for their scoutmaster. They organize a protest march, which makes it as far as a grocery store parking lot, and they try to draw a crowd using the comedy routine of a new kid at school named Jimmy Valmer. This is Jimmy's first appearance in the series, and the episode's title comes from what happens next, which is that Jimmy and Timmy, the show's existing disabled character, take an immediate dislike to each other and end up in an extended brawl that the assembled crowd finds far more entertaining than the protest. Cartman gives the fight its name and starts advertising it around town. The rivalry between the two of them runs underneath the entire episode and eventually resolves into one of the show's longer friendships. The legal side of the story escalates in parallel. Big Gay Al ends up represented by Gloria Allred, the real American attorney known for high-profile civil rights and discrimination cases, appearing as herself. The suit goes forward, and Big Gay Al wins. The court orders the Mountain Scouts to take him back, and he says no. This is the turn that makes the episode so contested among fans, because Big Gay Al's reasoning is not what anybody expects, and the show refuses to editorialize about it. He explains that he loves the Scouts, that they are a private group, and that he does not want to be forced on people who do not want him there, because a place a person has to be legally compelled into is not a place that has actually accepted him. He goes further than that and asks the public to stop pulling funding and support from the organization because he does not want the group damaged. He believes people should be talked into changing their minds rather than ordered to. Gloria Allred, standing right there, immediately calls him a homophobe. That final beat is the one people argue about. On one reading, it is the episode's thesis, which is that a court can hand a man a membership card, but it cannot hand him a welcome, and that changing what people actually believe is slower and more valuable than winning a ruling. On another reading, it is a fairly convenient conclusion for a show that wanted to needle the activist side of the debate as much as the conservative side, and it asks the person being excluded to be gracious about it, which is a lot to ask. What the episode does not do is let anybody off. The parents look ridiculous, and their judgment gets people hurt. The Mountain Scouts keep their policy and never change it. The activists are shown turning on the man they were supposedly defending the second he says something they did not script, and the replacement scoutmaster does eventually get arrested, but the episode is careful to make clear that this happens on its own, through nothing the boys or the protest accomplished. All of that noise, all of those marches and lawsuits and press conferences, and the only actual harm in the story gets stopped by unrelated luck. The fallout inside the show is unusually permanent for South Park. Big Gay Al does not get his troop back. He remains removed. The Mountain Scouts remain exactly as they were. There is no reset button, no closing scene where somebody learns something and the policy changes, which is notable for a series that had spent 4 seasons ending episodes with a boy explaining what he learned today. The episode simply stops with the situation unresolved, and everybody slightly worse off than they started. There is a quieter thing the episode does that often gets missed. Big Gay Al is the only adult in it who behaves reasonably at any point. The parents panic. The media inflates. The lawyer grandstands. The organization hides behind procedure. The one person with an actual stake in the outcome is also the only one who thinks about anybody other than himself, and he ends the episode with less than he started with. That pattern, where the show's gay characters are consistently the calmest and most sensible people in the room, while everyone around them loses their minds, runs through almost every episode in this history. The B-plot is doing more work than its reputation suggests. On the surface, it is 2 disabled children beating each other senseless in a parking lot while a crowd cheers, which is about as blunt as this show gets. But it is placed deliberately underneath a story about a group excluding someone for belonging to a category, and it spends its entire runtime showing 2 people from that same category refusing to have anything in common. Timmy does not like Jimmy, Jimmy. Jimmy does not like Timmy. Neither of them has any interest in being treated as half of a match set, and the crowd that gathers to watch them fight is the same crowd that spent the morning marching for tolerance. The episode does not connect those two things with a line of dialogue. It just puts them next to each other and lets the audience notice. Jimmy's arrival deserves a mention on its own, since he became one of the show's most durable supporting characters, and this is his starting point. He turns up as an aspiring stand-up comedian with a stutter and a set of catchphrases, and the boys immediately try to use him as entertainment to draw a crowd for a political cause he has no particular stake in. That is a fairly cynical way to introduce a character, and it establishes something about him that stuck. Jimmy is almost always the person being used by somebody else's plan, while cheerfully assuming he is the star of it. The visual staging of the episode makes one choice that most viewers never register. Big Gay Al is shown in full scouting uniform for most of his screen time, and the uniform fits him perfectly. He wears it correctly, knows all the traditions, and clearly takes the whole thing seriously. That is a small piece of character design carrying an argument. The parents object to him on the grounds that he is by nature foreign to what the organization stands for, and the show keeps him on screen in the exact clothes that prove he is not. He is not an outsider trying to force his way in. He is a lifelong member being told he was never really one of them. The behavior of the town's adults once the story becomes a story follows the same pattern. Nobody involved in the panic knows anything about Big Gay Al personally. Nobody asks the children how the meetings actually went. The objection arrives fully formed, based entirely on a category, and once it has been raised, nobody is willing to be the person who disagrees with it in public. Then, when the media coverage flips and the Mountain Scouts start being described as a hate group, the same crowd swings the other way just as fast and with just as little thought. The episode is at least as interested in how quickly people rearrange their stated beliefs to match whichever position currently costs them less, as it is in the underlying question. The episode has aged in an unusual direction. Plenty of South Park from this era now reads as a product of 2001 in ways the writers did not intend. Cripple Fight mostly does not, because the specific thing it satirizes, a public argument in which every participant is performing instead of persuading, has only become more familiar since. The title and the brawl are the parts that date it. The rest of it could be describing almost any week since. What it left behind extends past the show. The real story the episode was built on kept going for another 14 years. The Boy Scouts of America maintained its exclusion of openly gay members long after the ruling that allowed it, and the organization did not vote to allow openly gay youth members until 2013, with that change taking effect at the start of 2014. The blanket ban on openly gay adult leaders was not lifted until July of 2015. Big Gay Al's position in the episode, that the answer would eventually come from people changing their minds rather than from the courts, turned out to describe what actually happened, though it took considerably longer than anyone protesting in a grocery store parking lot in 2001 would have hoped. Inside the series, Cripple Fight served as the moment the show proved it could take a live, unresolved national argument, air an episode about it within a year, and refuse to give either side a clean win. That approach became the standard operating procedure for South Park's next 2 decades. It also gave the audience a version of Big Gay Al with an interior life, someone who could be hurt, who could lose something, and who could make a choice that the audience might disagree with. He was no longer only a punchline in pastel colors. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A year and a half later, the show sent a new character into a 4th grade classroom alongside Mr. Garrison, and the entire town decided it would rather be destroyed than admit out loud that anything was wrong. What followed was, by a wide margin, the most uncomfortable episode in this history, and it was aimed at the people who thought they were the good guys. Section 5. Nobody would stop him. The death camp of tolerance. Over the course of a few weeks, a 4th grade teacher and his new classroom assistant do everything 2 human beings could possibly do to get themselves fired, and every single adult in town responds by applauding them harder. The death camp of tolerance arrived as the 14th episode of season 6 and the 93rd of the series. Trey Parker wrote and directed it. The broadcast date was November 20th, 2002. The setup depends on where Mr. Garrison had been left. After coming out, he had been refused his old job and put in charge of kindergarten instead, several rungs down from where he started. When the 4th grade position opens up following the death of Miss Choksondik, Principal Victoria offers it to him, and her reason has nothing to do with his qualifications. The school has become deeply worried about how it would look to keep the openly gay teacher parked in kindergarten indefinitely. Garrison works out what that means almost immediately. If the school fires him for being gay, he can sue, and the number he lands on is $25 million. So he sets out to be fired. And because he has spent his entire adult life understanding exactly which buttons produce which reactions, his plan is to make himself impossible to keep by leaning into every stereotype and every provocation available on school property in front of children. To help with this, he brings in a teaching assistant, and this is where where Mr. Slave enters the series. Mr. Slave is voiced by John Hanson and is drawn as a leather-clad figure straight out of the most exaggerated corner of the Village People, mustache and cap and all, with a permanently exasperated voice and a habit of exclaiming under his breath at whatever fresh situation Garrison has put him in. He would go on to become one of the show's more prominent recurring characters, and this is his first appearance. What Garrison and Mr. Slave do in that classroom escalates over the course of the episode from awkward to openly explicit, and the show films it from the children's point of view. The boys are not amused. They are not scandalized in the way an adult audience might be. They are 10 years old, they are trapped in a room, and they are deeply uncomfortable, and the episode keeps returning to their faces as the person in charge of their education does things they have no framework for processing. Then the plan fails, and the reason it fails is the entire point of the episode. Nobody will fire him. Principal Victoria will not. The other teachers will not. The parents will not. Every escalation is met not with discipline, but with visible, performative approval, because the one thing every adult in South Park is more afraid of than anything happening in that classroom is being the person who objected to it. Garrison keeps raising the stakes, and the town keeps raising its applause, and the gap between the two grows until it becomes unnerving. The children do the reasonable thing and tell their parents, and the parents, hearing their sons describe a teacher behaving inappropriately in front of them, decide that the actual problem is that their sons are bigots. Discomfort with a gay man's behavior gets translated, without any examination whatsoever, into hatred of gay people. The complaint is not investigated. The specifics are not asked about. The category swallows the content, so the boys get punished. First, they are taken to a museum of tolerance, an educational facility full of exhibits about accepting people from different backgrounds, which the episode uses to land one of its cleanest jokes. At the end of the tour, a member of staff spots a man smoking on the grounds and turns on him with genuine viciousness, publicly humiliating him, and the visiting parents enthusiastically join in. The institution, built entirely around tolerance, has one group it is permitted to despise, and the moment that group appears, everyone drops the lesson instantly and with obvious relief. When the museum trip does not produce the required change of heart, the boys are sent to an actual camp, and the show stages the camp sequences in black and white, deliberately and unmistakably shot in the visual language of a Holocaust film, with direct nods to Schindler's List. The children are marched, ordered around, made to perform exercises about accepting other cultures, and starved. When their parents finally arrive to collect them, the boys are visibly emaciated and cannot speak. They just look at the adults who did this to them. Chef is the only grown-up who takes the complaint seriously at any stage. He listens to the boys, believes them, and reports it. His reward is to be sent to a tolerance seminar himself, which surprises both him and Garrison. The resolution arrives when Garrison, having run out of ideas, goes on stage at the Museum of Tolerance in front of the whole town and delivers an extended performance designed to be as offensive as any human being has ever managed. He is trying, one last time, to force somebody to object, and in the middle of the rant, carried away, he accidentally lets slip that the entire thing has been a scheme to get fired and collect a settlement. What happens next is the joke the episode has been building toward the whole time, and it is bleaker than the setup suggests. Garrison stops, he turns on the audience, and he tells them, with real anger, that the problem is not him. The problem is that they let him do all of it. He put an entire classroom of children through weeks of this, and not one adult in the town had the spine to say a word, because saying a word would have required a moment of social discomfort. The man who spent 4 seasons as the least self-aware person in Colorado ends this episode as the only one who sees clearly. Principal Victoria's response is to send Garrison and Mr. Slave to the tolerance camp on the grounds that they have been intolerant of their own homosexuality. It is a nonsense charge, invented on the spot to avoid admitting she was wrong about anything, and it lands them in the same black and white nightmare the children were just released from. Told they are about to endure a great deal of pain and suffering, Mr. Slave considers it briefly and decides it sounds like it could be fun. Running underneath all of this is a subplot involving the classroom's pet gerbil, Lemmywinks, who ends up somewhere he very much should not be during one of Garrison's demonstrations. The episode then follows the gerbil's long journey back out, and it does this as a full-scale parody of a Rankin and Bass-style fantasy adventure, complete with an original ballad, a narrator, and a series of guide characters who appear to counsel him along the route and hand him magical objects. It is a piece of fully committed silliness sitting inside one of the show's darkest episodes, and Lemmywinks became a recurring fan favorite off the back of it, eventually crowned king at the end of his quest. The argument the episode is making is blunt, and gay people are nowhere near the target of it. What the episode goes after is a specific failure mode, the confusion between tolerating something and being obligated to celebrate it. The word tolerance means putting up with something. South Park's adults have converted it into a demand for mandatory enthusiasm, and having done that, they can no longer distinguish between a person they dislike for who he is and a person behaving badly on purpose purpose. Garrison exploits that gap deliberately, and the town cannot close it, because closing it would require somebody to make a judgment about behavior instead of categories, and nobody wants to be the first to try. The episode is not without real problems, and the most frequently raised one should be stated plainly. In staging its tolerance camp as a concentration camp, the episode draws an equivalence between political correctness and the machinery of genocide, which is an enormous amount of weight to put on a joke about a museum field trip. It also does that without acknowledging anywhere that gay people were among the groups actually persecuted and killed in the camps being referenced. Critics have made that point since 2002, and it is not an unreasonable one. One structural choice deserves attention, because it is what keeps the episode from collapsing into simple shock. Almost every scene in the classroom is framed from the children's side of the room. The camera sits with the boys. It watches their faces while things happen behind them, cuts to their reactions instead of the events, and lets the audience share their position of being stuck in a room with no power to leave and no vocabulary to explain what is wrong. That framing is what makes the parents' response land as cruelly as it does. The audience has spent the episode sitting exactly where the boys are sitting, and then watches those boys get called bigots for describing what they saw. Mr. Slave's introduction is handled cleverly enough that people often assume he had been around longer. He arrives with no explanation, no backstory, and no introduction scene. He simply appears at Garrison's side as though he has always been there, delivers his lines in a strained, put-upon voice, and reacts to each new humiliation with the weary irritation of someone who has already agreed to this and is now regretting the details. Almost everything an audience learns about him arrives through those reactions, and not through dialogue about who he is. It is an efficient piece of character building, and it gave the show a second gay lead who was nothing like the first one. Big Gay Al is warm, sincere, and civic-minded. Mr. Slave is abrasive, transactional, and completely unbothered by anyone's opinion of him. Season 6 is also the moment this show stopped being what it had been. It is the season where Mr. Hat disappears for good, where a long-running voice cast member departs and a main character has to be written around, and where the storytelling starts leaning on real-world argument rather than surreal invention. The death camp of tolerance sits in the back half of that season, and it reads like a statement of intent. There is almost no fantasy in it apart from the gerbil. The plot is driven entirely by institutional cowardice, incentive structures, and the specific way adults behave when they are more afraid of an accusation than of a fact. The word at the center of the episode carries the argument by itself, which is probably why the writers built around it. Tolerance means enduring something. It is what a person does with a noise that cannot be stopped, or a colleague who cannot be avoided. Applied honestly, it asks very little of anybody, and that modesty is the reason it worked as a public standard for so long. The version the town has adopted asks for far more than endurance, and delivers far less than acceptance, because a person performing enthusiasm they do not feel has not actually changed their mind about anything. They have just added a layer of theater over it. The episode's final image, of two men being marched into a camp for insufficient enthusiasm about themselves, is the logical endpoint of taking that theater seriously. Reaction to the episode at the time was strong in both directions, and it has stayed that way. It regularly turns up on lists of the show's best episodes, usually credited for the Lemmy Wink sequence and for the sheer nerve of the final speech. It turns up just as regularly on lists of the show's most indefensible, usually for the camp imagery. Both readings are supportable from the same 22 minutes, which is a fairly reliable indicator that an episode is doing something more complicated than it first appears. What the episode left behind is a template the show returned to repeatedly and eventually built an entire season around. 13 years later, South Park would spend its 19th season on a headmaster whose entire personality was aggressive enforcement of correct language, and the argument in that season is the same argument being made here, scaled up and given a full arc. The death camp of tolerance is where the show first worked out that its most productive target on this subject was not people who hated gay people, since that target was easy and had been hit already, but people who had decided that the appearance of acceptance was the same thing as acceptance, and who would let almost anything happen rather than risk looking like they had objected to the wrong thing. It also gave the show Mr. Slave, who from this point forward is attached to Garrison and becomes the other half of nearly every major story in this history for the next several years. Their relationship, which starts here as a purely transactional arrangement built around a lawsuit, turns into something the series takes surprisingly seriously later on, to the point that its collapse drives 2 separate episodes and eventually changes state law inside the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Less than a year later, Garrison walked into a bar and discovered that every straight man in town had started dressing better, talking softer, and using words he had spent his whole life being mocked for using. He did not take it as progress, he took it as theft, and his reaction to it drove the strangest episode in this entire history. Section 6, the fad that stole his identity. South Park is gay. Mr. Garrison walks into a bar in his own town and finds every man in the place dressed better than he is, talking softer than he does, and using turns of phrase he has been mocked for using since 1997. He assumes, for one brief happy moment, that something wonderful has happened. Then he starts talking to them and finds out that not one of them is gay. South Park is Gay landed as the 8th episode of season 7 and the 104th overall, again written and directed by Trey Parker, and it aired on October 22, 2003. The real-world context here is tightly dated, and the episode is essentially a time capsule of a 3-month period in American culture. In July of 2003, Bravo premiered Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, in which 5 gay men descended on an unstylish heterosexual man and remade his wardrobe, his apartment, his grooming, and his cooking over the course of an episode. It became a genuine phenomenon almost immediately, and attached to it, the word metrosexual, originally coined by the British writer Mark Simpson back in 1994, suddenly went everywhere. It described a straight man who cared about clothes, skincare, and interior design, and the American Dialect Society would go on to vote it the word of the year for 2003. South Park's episode aired in October, roughly at the peak of the noise. The episode opens at the bus stop, and the show establishes the change with almost no dialogue. Stan, Cartman, and Kenny are standing there in new outfits. Stan in a fishnet-style vest, Kenny in a pink and purple parka in place of his usual orange, all 3 of them speaking in an exaggeratedly soft, breathy manner and complaining about laundry damage to a pajama top. Then Kyle arrives in the same jacket and hat he has worn since the first episode and gets treated as though he has turned up in rags. The boys give Kyle a makeover because that is what the fad demands, and Kyle goes home looking like everybody else. His mother's reaction is exactly what anyone would expect from Sheila Broflovsky, which is that the world is ending. She and Gerald go to the Marsh house to raise the alarm and discover that every adult man there is parked in front of the television watching Queer Eye and taking notes. From there, the fad consumes the town completely, and the show tracks it with the specific eye of writers who had been watching this happen in real life for 4 months. The competition between Cartman's group and Craig's group over who is more metrosexual is exactly the dynamic that makes fashion fads unbearable, since the point stops being the clothes and becomes a ranking system. Kyle's refusal to participate gets used by both sides as ammunition against each other, and the women of South Park, who might have been expected to enjoy the improvement, get tired of it fast, because a house full of men fighting over moisturizer is not actually more pleasant than a house full of men who do not. Garrison's storyline is the one worth taking seriously, and it is the sharpest thing in the episode by a wide margin. For 6 seasons, this character has been defined by his sexuality, first through denial, and then through aggressive, deliberate performance. He has been demoted for it, laughed at for it, and put through a tolerance camp because of it. And now, suddenly, every straight man in Colorado is doing an impression of him and being congratulated for how modern it makes them. He goes to the bar hoping to find people like him, and instead finds a room full of men who have adopted the surface and none of the substance. When he works out what has actually happened, he does not experience it as acceptance. He experiences it as theft. He liked being one of the few gay men in South Park, partly because it gave him a place in the world that nobody else could occupy, and the fad has taken that place and handed it out to anybody willing to buy the right shirt. He complains about it to Mr. Slave that night, and the complaint is the most sympathetic Garrison has ever been. It also happens to be a real argument that was being made at the time by real people in considerably more polite language. Queer Eye was praised for putting gay men on network television in prime time and criticized for the specific role it put them in, which was service. 5 men whose function in the show was to improve a straight man's life and then leave. The episode makes that criticism in the crudest way available, by having the one openly gay character in town notice that his entire identity has been converted into a consumer trend that does not include him. Then the episode takes a hard left turn into the thing it is now most remembered for. Kyle, still refusing to conform, ends up in New York, where the Queer Eye hosts are celebrating their ratings, and Kyle discovers, hiding under a table, that the 5 of them are not what they appear to be. They are crab people, an underground species, and they have a plan. Their intention is to turn every man on the surface metrosexual, on the reasoning that men who are entirely preoccupied with grooming and interior design will be incapable of defending the surface world when the crab people come up to take it. The reveal is delivered with a chant, the crab people repeating their own name in a low, flat voice, and that single piece of nonsense outlived the entire rest of the episode. Crab people became one of the most quoted running jokes in the series, returning in later episodes and lodging permanently in the show's mythology. It is an odd piece of writing, in that it arrives from nowhere, has no thematic connection to anything that precedes it, and is funnier than anything else in the episode precisely because of that. Kyle's refusal to change is what allows him to see through it, and the fad collapses once the truth is out. The town goes back to normal, the men return to their old clothes, and the joke underneath the ending is that a cultural fad this total and this obsessive can evaporate in a single afternoon, leaving nothing behind, because nobody involved ever believed in any of it. The show's own creators have not been kind to this one. In a 2011 list compiled for Entertainment Weekly, Trey Parker and Matt Stone named South Park is Gay among their least favorite episodes of the series. Their general complaint about episodes from this period tends to be that some of them were built too closely around a single trend, and this episode is a particularly clear case since it is about a fad that had largely burned out within a year of the broadcast. Watching it now requires a certain amount of historical reconstruction to remember why anybody cared, but the parts that hold up unusually well. The Garrison material is the show making a point about representation that most commentary at the time was too careful to make out loud, which is that being visible and being included are different things, and that a culture can take everything ornamental about a group and leave the group itself exactly where it was. That argument did not date. If anything, it got more relevant as the decades went on and the pattern repeated with different trends. One thing this episode does with Kyle tends to go unnoticed. In almost every South Park story about a town-wide fad, the holdout character is being set up for humiliation, and the episode usually ends with the holdout learning to loosen up. This one does not. Kyle is right from the first scene to the last. His stubbornness is what saves everybody. The show handed its moral center to the one kid who refused to change his jacket, and it did that in an episode whose title is a joke about the whole town going gay. The episode leans on music to do a lot of its scene setting, and the track it borrows is the actual theme from the real program, All Things Just Keep Getting Better by Wildlife. Dropping the genuine song into the episode does something a parody composition would not have done. It collapses the distance between the fictional fad and the real one, so that the audience watching in October of 2003 was hearing, inside a cartoon, the exact piece of music they had been hearing on their own television for the previous 3 months. The episode is standing inside the trend rather than describing it from across the room. The visual design of the makeovers is more carefully observed than the broad tone suggests. Each boy ends up in a specific, recognizable version of the look that was actually being sold at the time, all layered pieces, and deliberate mismatching and accessories that serve no function. Kenny's parka change is the funniest one, because Kenny's parka is the single most fixed visual element in the entire series, the thing that never changes under any circumstances, and the episode changes it without comment. Kyle's ushanka and jacket surviving intact, while everything else in town transforms, is doing the same work from the opposite direction. The 5 hosts are not drawn as the real people, which is a striking choice given how freely this show has always caricatured actual celebrities. They are generic, interchangeable versions of the archetype instead of recognizable individuals, and that generality is what allows the crab people twist to work at all. If the episode had been aiming at 5 specific human beings, revealing them as an underground species plotting to conquer the surface would have read as an attack on those people. Keeping them anonymous turns the target into the format itself, and the format is what the episode actually has a problem with. Mr. Slave functions as the audience for Garrison's grievance, and the scene between them that night is the quietest in the episode. Garrison rants. Mr. Slave listens and mostly agrees, and neither of them arrives at any kind of resolution. There is nothing to be done about a fad. Nobody can argue with a trend or negotiate with it. It arrives, it takes what it wants, and it leaves when it gets bored, and the people it borrowed from are still standing there afterward with exactly the same lives they had before. The show gives that scene no punchline, which for South Park is close to a statement of sincerity. The larger idea underneath the whole episode is about consumption, and it is the idea that has aged best. A subculture develops its own signals over decades, usually because the people inside it had reasons to need signals that outsiders could not read. Then the signals get noticed, then they get sold, and then they get worn by people who paid nothing for them and can put them down whenever they stop being fashionable. Garrison cannot put his down. That is the whole complaint, delivered by a character the show had spent 6 seasons making almost impossible to sympathize with, in an episode whose title is a cheap joke. As for the crab people, they refused to stay in this episode. They resurfaced in later seasons, treated as an established part of the show's world rather than as a one-time gag, and their chant became one of those pieces of South Park shorthand that circulated far beyond the audience for the episode itself. Plenty of people can do the voice without having any idea it came from an episode about Queer Eye. That is a strange fate for a plot twist, and it is probably the single clearest illustration of how this show's most memorable material is frequently the material with the least to do with whatever the episode was actually arguing about. What South Park is Gay left behind is mostly the crab people and a very precise photograph of late 2003. The metrosexual moment vanished so completely that the word now sounds like it belongs to a different century, which it does. Queer Eye ran for another few years, ended, and eventually came back in a different form for a different audience. And Garrison's complaint, that being copied is not the same thing as being accepted, kept getting made by other people in other rooms for the next 20 years, usually in far more measured language, and usually to considerably less effect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A season and a half later, the show opened a brand new year with a decision it had no way to walk back. In the space of one cold open, the character at the center of nearly every story in this history stopped being the man everybody had been watching for 8 years, and the show spent the next 4 seasons dealing with the consequences. Section 7. The premiere that changed the character. Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina. A 9th season of television opens on an operating table in a Colorado medical center, with a surgeon asking his patient whether he is certain about this, and the patient explaining that he has always been a woman trapped in a man's body. The episode is Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina, the first episode of season 9 and the 126th of the series. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, and it opened the season on March 9, 2005. There is a real-world detail buried in the setting that most viewers walked straight past. The surgery takes place at the Trinidad Medical Center, performed by a doctor named Bieber. Trinidad is a real town in southern Colorado, and for decades it was known across the country as the place people went for this operation, because of a real surgeon named Stanley Bieber who worked there and performed thousands of these procedures over the course of his career. He was still alive when the episode aired. Of all the things South Park could have invented for this story, the location and the surgeon's name were not among them. The production history is unusually candid. According to the commentary recorded for the episode, Parker and Stone went into that season with almost nothing. 2 ideas total, one about hippies and one about Garrison having this surgery, and improvised the rest of the year as they went. Parker has described being so overwhelmed in the days before this episode aired that he came close to walking away from the show entirely. And the surgery sequence itself, which cuts to brief flashes of real footage, originally ran to more than 5 minutes of genuine operating room material, included largely because the team had no other ideas for how to fill the time. Comedy Central objected, and the final version is 3 flashes of about a second each. The episode is built as 3 parallel stories, and the parallel is the argument. Garrison has the operation and is delighted with the outcome. She goes shopping, buys tampons, uses the women's bathroom, and announces the change to everyone she meets with the same total lack of self-consciousness the character has brought to everything since coming out. The town's reaction is mostly bewildered acceptance. The boys run into her on the street, do not understand what has happened, and accept it anyway because she is their teacher, and this is South Park. Kyle, meanwhile, fails to make a state basketball team. The coach tells him, flatly, that Jewish people cannot play basketball, and the boys who did make the team are all tall and black. Kyle takes this badly. At home, he asks his parents about what Garrison has done, and his mother explains that people have these surgeries because who they are on the outside does not match who they are on the inside. Kyle listens to that explanation, applies it to his own situation, and concludes that he is a tall black man trapped in a short Jewish boy's body. He goes to Trinidad and asks Dr. Bieber for the same service, and Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, watching all of this, decides that he has always felt like a dolphin and gets surgery to become one. The 3 storylines are deliberately laid on top of each other so that the audience cannot consider one without considering the others, and that structure is what the episode's critics and its defenders have been arguing about ever since. Placing a real medical procedure that real people undergo alongside a boy wanting to be a different race and a middle-aged lawyer wanting to be a marine mammal is a statement about all 3, and it is not a subtle one. The show's position becomes explicit in the final act. Kyle's surgery, it turns out, was cosmetic only. Nothing about his body actually changed apart from its appearance, and this becomes horrifyingly clear during a basketball game when the alterations fail catastrophically in front of a crowd. Dr. Bieber apologizes and admits he should have explained the limits in advance, and offers to reverse both his procedure and Gerald's, which they accept. Garrison does not reverse hers. She learns that the operation has not made her biologically female and cannot, that certain things are permanently unavailable to her, and she decides to stay as she is anyway. The show gives her a moment addressing the audience directly to confirm that she is not changing back. Mr. Slave leaves, and his reasoning is the part of the episode that lands cleanest, because it has nothing to do with medicine or biology, and everything to do with 2 people. Mr. Slave is gay. He is attracted to men. Garrison made this decision without consulting him and without any apparent thought about what it would mean for their relationship, and when he raises this, Garrison's suggestion is that he simply stop being gay. It is the exact demand Garrison spent 4 seasons refusing to accept from anybody else, delivered without a flicker of recognition to the person closest to him. The reception of this episode has hardened considerably over the 20 years since. At the time, it was covered mostly as another South Park provocation among many, in a season that also included the Scientology episode and a great deal of other controversy. In the years since, it has become one of the most frequently cited examples in arguments about the show's treatment of transgender people, and the criticisms are specific rather than general. The equivalent structure treats one group's experience as interchangeable with a joke about wanting to be a dolphin. The inclusion of real surgical footage was widely read as designed to disgust rather than to inform. And the episode's conclusion, that these procedures are cosmetic and change nothing underneath, is presented as a settled fact rather than as a position. The defenses that get offered are also specific. The episode aired in early 2005, well before the subject had anything like its current public profile, and it was engaging with something almost no other mainstream comedy was engaging with at all. Some viewers read the core argument as being about the limits of what surgery can do, rather than about the people who seek it. And Garrison, notably, is the only one of the three who is allowed to keep her decision and be right about it for herself, which is a strange choice for an episode supposedly arguing that the decision is illegitimate. What is not in dispute is how long the show committed to it. Garrison remained a woman for 3 full seasons, across dozens of episodes, and the change was treated as permanent instead of as a gag to be forgotten. During that stretch, she has relationships, has an entire storyline where she ends up in a lesbian bar and identifies as a lesbian for a while, in the season 11 episode D Yikes, and continues to be the 4th grade teacher throughout. For a series that resets nearly everything, keeping a lead character's fundamental status changed for 3 years is close to unprecedented. The reversal came in the 5th episode of season 12, called Eek a Penis, which aired on April 9th, 2008. In that episode, Garrison, having watched a news story about pregnancy, realizes she wants children, discovers this is not going to happen, and decides the entire thing was a mistake. She sets out to reverse it through an experimental procedure involving growing tissue from her own DNA, and the episode turns into a chase. Garrison ends the story back as a man, but permanently altered by the round trip, since not everything that was removed on the way out could be restored on the way back. That double reversal is where the character sits today, and it is also where the show's own position gets complicated. 6 years after Eek a Penis, South Park aired The Sissy, the 3rd episode of season 18 and the 250th of the series, on October 8th, 2014. That episode is about bathroom access and about Cartman claiming an identity purely to get a private toilet, and its treatment of the actual transgender character in it is notably gentler than anything the show had done on the subject before, and it uses Garrison as a voice of experience, having him advise the principal on how to handle the situation on the grounds that he has been through a version of it himself. The design work that came with the change signals how seriously the show intended to commit. From this episode onward, the character is Mrs. Garrison, and every other character in town uses that name without comment. Garrison was redrawn from scratch, with new hair, a new wardrobe, and a new silhouette, and that redesign stayed in place across 3 seasons of episodes, with no cutting back to the old model for convenience. Animation is expensive in exactly this way. Every background appearance, every crowd scene, every classroom shot for 3 years used the new design. A show that wanted to treat this as a one-week joke would not have paid for that. The reaction of the children is the quietest and most interesting thing in the episode, and it goes almost entirely uncommented on. The boys run into their teacher on the street shortly after the operation, register that something has happened, do not understand it, and accept it anyway. There is no lesson attached to that beat, and nobody makes a speech about it. They are 10, an adult they know has done something they cannot follow, and they move on with their day. In an episode built on an argument about identity, the only characters who behave decently about it are the ones who have not thought about it at all. Season 9 as a whole is the reason this episode gets less attention than its content would suggest. That same year, the show produced the episode about a certain religion and a certain actor that generated a genuine institutional crisis, an episode about a boy in a persistent vegetative state that landed while a nearly identical case was in every American newspaper, and an Emmy-winning half hour. This premiere was, by the standards of the season around it, not the thing anybody was arguing about that month. Its reputation grew afterward as the subject matter became a live public argument and people went back to see what the show had already said about it. The construction of the middle storyline deserves one more look, because the episode is doing something specific with Kyle rather than simply using him for shock. Kyle is not told he is bad at basketball. He is told he is barred from being good at it by something about himself he cannot change, and the coach says it out loud, casually, as an established fact. That is real discrimination, presented plainly, and Kyle's response to it is to seek a surgical solution to a social problem. The episode then punishes him for it in the most graphic way available. Whatever else the parallel structure is doing, the Kyle plot treats his complaint as real and treats the fix he reached for as doomed from the start. It should also be said plainly that this is an episode people are entitled to dislike, and that a fair account of this history has to include the fact that a great many viewers do. The show has been in the business of offending people since 1997, and most of the time the offense is the delivery mechanism for something underneath it. The reason this episode keeps coming up in a way that, for instance, the Tolerance Camp episode does not, is that a substantial number of viewers do not believe there is anything underneath it beyond the joke. That reading is available from the material, so is the other one. What is not available is any version where the episode is doing nothing at all, because it changed challenged the show's most durable adult character for 3 years, and the writers went back to argue with themselves about it twice more over the following decade. What Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina left behind, then, is not a single settled statement, but a long and visibly changing one. The episode is the show at its most deliberately provocative, built in a hurry by two people who admit they had no plan for the season, and it made a permanent change to its most important recurring adult character on the strength of an idea they had before they had any others. It also produced the most human beat in the entire history of Garrison and Mr. Slave, which is a man being told by his partner that the solution to his objection is to stop being who he is. That betrayal did not stay in this episode. Mr. Slave walked out at the end of it, and where he ended up next turned into a much bigger story, one that eventually reached the governor of Colorado. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 months later, the show came back to that breakup and used it to set up something considerably larger: a jilted ex, a classroom project involving eggs, and a bill sitting on a governor's desk turned into the closest South Park ever came to writing an actual civil rights episode, and it did it while pretending to be about homework. Section 8, the egg that changed the law. Follow that egg. A 4th grade teacher hands out eggs to her students, pairs them off, and tells them to keep the eggs safe for a week as a lesson in parenting. It is one of the oldest classroom exercises in American schooling. It is also, in this case, a rigged experiment designed to produce a specific result and kill a piece of state legislation. Follow That Egg ran as the 10th episode of season 9 and the 135th overall, again from Trey Parker as writer and director, and it aired on November 2nd, 2005. The timing puts it in the middle of the loudest argument in American domestic politics at that moment. Massachusetts had become the first state to allow same-sex marriage in 2004. In the general election that November, 11 states had passed constitutional amendments banning it, most of them by wide margins. There was an ongoing push for a federal amendment. Civil unions were being offered in several places as a compromise, and were being rejected by advocates on the grounds that a separate name for the same arrangement was the point rather than an oversight. Colorado, where the show is set, would pass its own ban the following year. This episode arrived directly into that. The plot starts with the wreckage of the previous section. Mr. Slave walked out on Garrison after the operation, and Garrison, some months on, decides she wants him back. She turns up expecting to reconcile and discovers that Mr. Slave has moved on entirely. He is with Big Gay Al now. The two of them are engaged, and they are waiting on one thing before the wedding, which is the governor of Colorado signing a same-sex marriage bill currently sitting on his desk. So Garrison sets out to stop the bill. Her method gives the episode its structure. Rather than campaigning directly, she decides to produce evidence, and the evidence she wants is proof that same-sex couples cannot raise children. She has a classroom of 9 and 10-year-olds and a parenting assignment, and she uses them. The eggs go out, pairs are assigned, and then Garrison rearranges the assignments so that two boys, Stan and Kyle, end up as a pair, expecting them to fail publicly and hand her a headline. Running alongside that is a subplot about Stan and Wendy, who had broken up some time earlier and had not spoken since. Stan spends the opening of the episode terrified that he will be assigned to her and secretly hoping for it, and then watches her get paired with Kyle instead while he gets BB. It is a small, well-observed piece of 10-year-old misery, and it matters because it is the thing occupying Stan's attention, while the actual plot of the episode assembles itself around him. Once the boys are paired, Garrison starts interfering. The egg does not break on its own, so she arranges for it to break. When that fails, she escalates, and the escalation is where the episode abandons realism entirely. Garrison hires a professional assassin to destroy the egg. The final stretch of the story is two 4th graders running across town toward the governor's press conference under live gunfire, with explosives going off around them, protecting a single egg. The politics happening on the other side of that chase are handled with a precision that is easy to miss under the noise. The governor, looking for a way out, proposes a compromise. He will not call it marriage. Instead, every legal reference to relationships between two men will use a different term, a crude one invented for the purpose, and everything else stays the same. He also notes, without any apparent awareness of what he is saying, that this arrangement makes no provision for gay women at all, because nobody has thought about them. The compromise is offered as reasonable and generous. It is rejected immediately. That joke is doing real work, because it is a direct model of the civil union argument that was actually being had at the time. The offer on the table in several states was a parallel institution with a different name and broadly similar rights, and the response from advocates was that a separate name for the same thing exists specifically to communicate that the thing is not the same. South Park makes that point by inventing the most obviously insulting possible label and having a politician present it with a straight face as a solution everyone should be pleased with. Stan and Kyle reach the podium. They are exhausted, injured, and barely able to speak. Stan hands over the egg, intact, and passes out. And on the strength of that single unbroken egg, the governor governor signs, and same-sex marriage becomes legal in the state. The episode ends with a wedding. Mr. Slave and Big Gay Al are married, with Father Maxey officiating, which is its own quiet piece of business, given that Maxey is the town's Catholic priest, and the year is 2005. Randy Marsh finds Stan and Kyle afterward, and tells them how proud he is of what they did for gay rights. Kyle, who has spent the entire episode running away from a hitman while holding an egg and has no idea what any of it was about, asks him what exactly they did. That final exchange is the episode's actual thesis, and it is more cynical than the warm ending suggests. The two people who decided the outcome of a major civil rights question had no idea a civil rights question was being decided. They were doing homework. The adult who nearly stopped it had no principled objection to anything and was acting entirely out of jealousy over a breakup, using the language of protecting children as cover for a personal grudge. The governor's position was determined by whichever way the wind was blowing at the press conference. Nobody with any power over the outcome was thinking about the outcome, and yet, having said all of that, the episode arrives somewhere unambiguous. The bill passes, the couple gets married, the show gives them a real wedding with a real ceremony, presented without a punchline attached to the vows. For a series whose entire reputation is built on refusing to endorse anything, Follow That Egg lands about as close to a clear position as South Park has ever landed on any subject in this history. The Stan and Wendy subplot resolves in a way that also refuses the expected shape. Wendy, having watched Stan succeed at the assignment, apologizes to him for doubting he could handle it, and Stan, who has spent the whole episode desperate for her approval, no longer wants it and brushes her off. She leaves upset. It is a small, sour ending for a plot that had been running as a romance, and it fits the episode's general theory that people rarely get the resolution they spent the week wanting. There is one more piece of context here. This episode aired on November 2nd, 2005. The Supreme Court decision in Obergefell against Hodges, which made same-sex marriage legal nationwide in the United States, was handed down on June 26, 2015. South Park married two of its recurring characters, on screen, with a priest, nearly 10 years before that happened, in an episode where the mechanism was a school project and the villain was a jealous ex. The egg assignment itself is a well-chosen piece of set dressing, because almost everyone watching had done a version of it. The exercise, in its various forms with eggs or sacks of flour or electronic dolls, had been a fixture of American schools for decades, always presented as a lesson in responsibility and always producing far more cheating than parenting. South Park uses that familiarity as a shortcut. The audience already knows the assignment is a bit silly, already knows nobody learns anything from it, and is therefore already primed to find it absurd when an adult treats the results as scientific evidence about who should be allowed to raise children. There is a small joke at the very start of the handout that sets the tone for how carefully the episode is watching its own adults. Every child in the class receives a white egg, except for the one black student in the room, who is handed a brown one. Nobody remarks on it. The camera holds on his face just long enough for the audience to register the expression, and then the scene moves on. It is 3 seconds long, it has nothing to do with the plot, and it tells the audience everything about the teacher running the experiment. Cartman's contribution to the assignment is one of the better small character beats in the season. He breaks his egg almost immediately, and instead of hiding it, he goes to Garrison and confesses, and asks her to fail him and give his partner top marks, since the fault was entirely his. It is a startlingly decent request from the least decent character on television, and it lasts exactly as long as it takes him to finish the sentence, because he then asks for the two grades to be averaged together into something he can live with. The generosity was a negotiating position. He has invented a system where taking responsibility costs him nothing and improves his grade. The assassin is played completely straight, which is what makes the last act work. He is not a comedy hitman. He is a professional, filmed like a professional, and the sequence where he takes up a position and begins firing on two children in an open street is shot with the visual language of a thriller rather than a cartoon. The escalation from a teacher tampering with a school project to live gunfire happens gradually enough that the audience does not get an obvious moment to object, which is exactly how the episode wants it. Garrison never makes a decision to become dangerous. She just keeps making the next small decision, and each one is only slightly worse than the last. Big Gay Al and Mr. Slave function here as a genuine couple, rather than as two gay characters standing near each other, and the difference is noticeable. They have a shared plan. They have a timeline. They are waiting on a piece of paperwork like every other engaged couple in the country was at the time, and the obstacle in their way is not hostility from the town, which barely registers an opinion, but one specific person with a personal grievance and access to a classroom. That is a fairly precise observation about how these fights often actually run. The public argument is conducted in the language of principle, and the people driving it hardest frequently have a private reason they are not mentioning. Father Maxey's presence at the wedding deserves one more sentence, because South Park had been using him for years as the show's chief representative of institutional religion. conclusion, usually to make him ridiculous, and occasionally to let him be the only adult in the episode who is right. Handing him the ceremony rather than inventing some generic officiant is a deliberate choice, and it is made without any dialogue drawing attention to it. He simply performs the wedding, and the show declines to have anybody in the church object. Critically, the episode has held up better than most of the season around it. Reviewers at the time noted the unusual clarity of its position, and it turns up regularly on lists of the episodes people point to when arguing that this show has never been as simply nihilistic as its reputation claims. It is also one of the few South Park episodes where knowing the exact date of broadcast changes how it plays. Watched cold. It looks like a broad comedy about a school project. Watched with November of 2005 in mind, it looks like a show planting a flag in the middle of an argument that most primetime comedy at the time was carefully declining to touch. What Follow That Egg left behind is the high watermark for these characters. Big Gay Al and Mr. Slave, introduced 8 and 3 years earlier respectively as broad jokes, end the episode married to each other in front of the whole town. Neither of them does anything ridiculous during the wedding. The show, which had spent nearly a decade putting these two through every indignity available, gave them the ending it almost never gives anybody, which is the thing they wanted, without a twist attached. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A season and a half later, the show turned the subject on a child, and it stopped being funny in a way South Park very rarely allows. There is no political target in what comes next, no institution to satirize, and no fad to mock. There is a child in genuine distress at that camp, and the only person who reaches him is another child who does not even understand why he is there. Section 9. The camp that cured nobody. Cartman sucks. The facility has a cheerful welcome sign, a staff of smiling counselors, and a bus that pulls up outside it carrying a group of small boys. The place is called Camp New Grace, and the service it offers is the elimination of homosexual feelings in children through prayer. Cartman Sucks is the second episode of season 11. It was written and directed by Trey Parker, and it reached air on March 14, 2007. The route that gets Butters to that bus is a chain of misunderstandings, and the details matter less than the shape. Cartman plays a prank on Butters involving a photograph, one designed to embarrass Butters, and which instead lands squarely on Cartman himself. In attempting to undo it, Cartman engineers a second situation, and Butters' father Steven walks in on the tail end of that one. Steven does not ask what happened. He does not check with anybody. He arrives at a conclusion in about 4 seconds, decides his son is bi-curious, and starts acting on that decision immediately. Butters, meanwhile, has no idea what any of this is about. He does not know what Cartman was doing. He does not know what the word his father is using means. And because Butters is Butters, and because agreeing with adults is the only survival strategy he has ever had, he goes along with it. His father says he is confused, so he accepts that he must be confused about a thing he had never once thought about before that afternoon. Father Maxie is consulted, and it is Maxie who recommends the camp. That detail lands strangely, because the same priest had officiated the wedding of 2 men on this show 16 months earlier. South Park does not acknowledge the contradiction, and there is no sign the writers noticed it. That is a fairly good illustration of how the series holds its positions, which is episode by episode and never as a consistent worldview. Camp New Grace is where the episode stops being funny in the way South Park is usually funny, and the show seems entirely aware of the change. The camp's central program is a buddy system. Each boy is assigned another boy with the same issue, and the 2 of them are made responsible for one another, kept together at all times, and told they will be saving each other's souls. The staff have invented a word for it and repeat the word with enormous pride, and the arrangement is, as an approach to the stated problem, precisely backwards. A facility that exists to stop boys being attracted to boys has responded by pairing them off and requiring them to spend every waking moment together. The show does not need to comment on this. It simply lets the counselors explain the system enthusiastically and lets the audience do the arithmetic. The staff themselves are drawn without warmth. They are not villains in any dramatic sense, and nobody is twirling a mustache. They are administrators. They are impatient with the boys in their care, dismissive of anything the boys say about how they are feeling, and visibly more interested in the program running smoothly than in whether it works. One of the counselors, a pastor, is transparently gay himself and gives every sign of having been through this same process without result, and the show plays him not as a hypocrite but as a casualty who is now employed running the thing that failed him, and the boys at the camp are in real trouble. The episode makes it clear, without any joke attached, that children are being harmed by being there, and that the staff treat each incident as a scheduling problem rather than an emergency. It is stated plainly and then left alone. In an episode from a show that had spent a decade turning every possible subject into a gag, that restraint is the loudest thing in it. Butters is assigned a boy named Bradley, and Bradley is the emotional center of the episode. Bradley is actually gay. He knows it, he has known it, and he has been told his entire life that this makes him broken. He also develops a crush on Butters, who is not gay, has no idea Bradley feels anything, and would not have understood it if he had been told. And Bradley reaches a point of despair that the episode does not minimize or play for comedy. What saves him is Butters, and what Butters says is the reason people still talk about this episode. The counselors try to keep Butters away, telling him he will only make things worse. He goes anyway, and what he says is not a defense of anybody's identity, because Butters does not have the vocabulary for that and would not know how to use it. He says he is tired of being told that he is confused, because he was not confused at all until adults started telling him he was. He points out that he was managing perfectly well before anybody explained to him that there was something wrong with him, and then, reaching for the only framework he has, he says that if people are made in God's image, then God must be a little bit bi-curious as well, and it does not seem to have caused God any problems. Bradley comes down. Nobody at the camp learns anything. The program does not change, but the immediate crisis passes, and it passes because a 10-year-old who understood none of the theology and none of the politics said the only true thing anybody had said in the building. The episode then closes on two punchlines, one for each plot. Steven collects his son and, on the drive home, mentions that on reflection, he might be a little bi-curious himself. Butters, who had spent the entire week being told what he was and had finally worked out that he was fine, ends the episode confused for the first time. And back at school, Cartman finally produces the photograph he has been panicking about for 3 days, only to be informed that it had been lost at his own house the entire time and nobody was ever going to see it. He shrugs and calls the whole thing lame. The real-world context is what gives the camp material its weight. In 2007, conversion therapy for minors was legal everywhere in the United States and practiced openly. Every major American medical and psychological association had already rejected it and had been saying so for years, but there were no laws restricting it. That did not begin to change until 2012, when California became the first state to prohibit licensed practitioners from providing it to minors. New Jersey followed the next year, and a long list of other states followed after that. South Park aired this episode 5 years before the first of those laws. The choice of Butters as the vehicle is what makes it work. Butters is the series' designated innocent, the character who believes what he is told and apologizes for things that are not his fault. Putting him in this story means the episode never has to argue about whether anybody deserves what is happening, because Butters has done nothing at all, does not understand what he is accused of, and agreed to the whole thing out of politeness. The episode clearly thinks the camp is cruel to gay children, and its larger argument goes past that. The confusion the camp claims to be treating was manufactured by adults, in this case in the space of a single afternoon, on the basis of no evidence, and then presented to a child as a fact about himself. Cartman Sucks holds a strange position in the show's reputation. It is frequently listed among the crudest episodes South Park has produced, on the strength of its opening act, and it is just as frequently listed among the most sincere, on the strength of everything that happens at the camp. Both are correct. It is an episode that spends its first 10 minutes on the most juvenile material available, and its last 10 minutes making an argument that a great many far more respectable programs were not making in 2007. The structural gamble of the episode is the gap between its two halves, and it is a bigger gamble than it looks. South Park usually keeps its A and B plots in roughly the same register, so that a silly main story gets a silly subplot and a serious one gets a serious counterweight. This episode runs the crudest possible material next to the most sincere material the show had produced in years, with no tonal bridge between them, cutting back and forth between a boy in genuine crisis and a boy panicking about a lost photograph. It should not work. What makes it work is that Cartman's plot is entirely about consequences he brought on himself and can end at any time by admitting what he did, and Butters' plot is entirely about consequences he did not cause and cannot end at all. The contrast is the argument. Bradley is a good piece of character design precisely because there is so little to him. He gets a handful of scenes and almost no backstory. He is not given a tragic family or a dramatic incident to explain his state. He is simply a boy who has been told for as long as he can remember that the thing he is constitutes a defect, and who has believed it because children believe what adults tell them about themselves. The episode does not need to build a case. It just shows what that belief looks like from the inside, on a child, and then shows an adult institution treating the result as a scheduling matter. Steven Stotch is the other adult in this story, and the episode spends very little time condemning him and a great deal of time on how he thinks. He is not shown as hateful. He is shown as a man who received a piece of information he did not want, panicked, reached for the nearest available solution, and then never once revisited the decision. He does not check with his son. He does not ask what actually happened. He never considers the possibility that he might have misread the situation, and the episode's final joke depends on the fact that he still has not considered it while driving his son home. Plenty of harm in this history gets done by people who are furious. This particular harm gets done by a man man who was embarrassed. The camp itself is dressed with real attention. The name is warm. The signage is welcoming. The counselors smile constantly and speak in the encouraging cadence of summer camp staff everywhere. Nothing about the visual presentation signals a place where anything bad happens, and that mismatch between the surface and the substance does more work than a sinister design would have done. Institutions that harm children rarely look like they harm children. They usually look like Camp New Grace, with a nice logo and a program with a friendly name and staff who believe they are helping. Butters carrying the weight here is part of a longer pattern in the series, and it is not an accident that the show reaches for him when it wants to be sincere. Over the years, whenever South Park has wanted to say something without irony, it has tended to hand the line to Butters, because he is the only character on the show who can deliver a straightforward statement without the audience assuming a joke is coming. Stan and Kyle both function as moral centers, but they function as arguers, and their speeches are usually structured as the resolution of a debate. Butters does not debate. He states what he has noticed. In this episode, what he has noticed is that he was fine yesterday, which is the entire case against everything happening in that building, expressed in the only terms a 10-year-old has available. The episode's afterlife has been shaped almost entirely by that scene. Clips of it circulate constantly, usually stripped of the surrounding episode and often shared by people who would not describe themselves as fans of the show at all. That has produced the slightly odd situation where one of South Park's most quoted sincere moments sits inside an episode most of those viewers would find unpleasant if they watched it from the beginning. The show has never been especially interested in resolving that tension, and by this point in its run, it had clearly stopped trying. What it left behind is a speech. Butters' words at that camp circulated far past the audience for the episode, quoted by people who had never watched the show, and they turned up in conversations about conversion therapy for years afterward. It is not a sophisticated argument. It contains no data and no policy. It is a small boy pointing out that he was doing fine until the adults arrive, which happens to be the only thing anybody in that building needed to hear. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, the show went after a word rather than an institution, and it got the loudest condemnation of its career from the exact organization that had nominated it for an award in 1998. 6 years after that, it quietly made two of its own characters a couple and let the fans decide who they were. Section 10. The Word and the Couple. The F-Word and Tweak X Craig. For several days, a group of motorcycle riders drives up and down the streets of a quiet mountain town, revving their engines as loudly as possible in front of anybody who might notice. That is the entire provocation. Nobody is robbed, nobody is threatened, and nothing is damaged. 4 10-year-olds decide that a specific word describes these men perfectly and then set out to have the dictionary agree with them. The F-Word is the 12th episode of season 13 and the 193rd overall. Trey Parker was again the writer and director. It first aired on November 4th, 2009. The word in question is the slur that had been circling this show since 1997, and the episode's proposal is that it should be reassigned. The boys argue that when they use it, they are not talking about gay people at all. They are talking about a specific type of person who makes a great deal of noise purely so that strangers will look at him. Stan puts it more bluntly than that in front of the city council, and the council is asked to formally recognize the new meaning. The way the boys campaign for this brings the episode its first real complication. They vandalize the town. Cartman does something unrepeatable to the motorcycles themselves, and Stan and Kyle spray paint a message on buildings around South Park telling the people they mean to drive out that they should leave. And the two residents who see that graffiti and take it personally are Big Gay Al and Mr. Slave, who have no reason on earth to read it any other way. They interpret it as exactly what it looks like, which is a threat aimed at them, and they are frightened. Called before the council, the boys explain themselves, and they do it with total sincerity. They are not defending an insult. They do not connect the word to gay people, because in their experience, it has never meant that. They have grown up in a town with an openly gay teacher, a married gay couple, and a community they see at the grocery store, and none of them has ever associated any of that with the word they have been using about loud men on motorcycles. Big Gay Al's response is the argument the episode wants to make. He tells the gay community of South Park that these words are not going to disappear, because people enjoy saying them far too much for that ever to happen. He says that gay people are no longer the most despised group in the country, and that this creates an opening. And he proposes that, instead of fighting the word forever, they help the children finish the job of changing what it points at. Running underneath that is a scene in the library where the bikers, trying to work out what they have been called, read the entry in a dictionary and trace the history of the word. And the history really is a series of reassignments. It has meant an unpleasant older woman. It has meant a bundle of sticks, and then the people who gathered them, and then any awkward load somebody had to carry. It has been used as an insult about the elderly. Its use as an anti-gay slur is a comparatively recent stop on a long route. The bikers, reading all all of this, complain that the word will not stay still. The town brings in a body called the English Dictionary Officiates to rule on the change, headed by the former child actor Emmanuel Lewis, appearing as himself. The bikers riot at the ceremony, tear up the town, and corner the boys in an alley. Butters, of all people, steps in to defend the riders, explaining that he admires the whole Harley lifestyle and wants to be part of it one day. And then Big Gay Al arrives at the head of an armed group of the town's gay residents, at which point the bikers accept their new label without further argument. Lewis declares the definition changed. The episode ends on a title card printing the new entry. The response arrived the following day. On November 5th, 2009, GLAAD publicly condemned the episode. The organization's position was that whatever the intent, the word had been said dozens of times by children on national television, and that the effect of that is not neutralized by a plot in which everyone agrees it now means something else. GLAAD described it as a slur-filled episode, urged viewers to contact Comedy Central, and asked Parker and Stone for an apology. Comedy Central declined to comment. No apology was given. The symmetry there is the whole point. The same organization had nominated this show's 4th ever episode for one of its own awards in 1998, 11 years earlier, for its handling of exactly this subject. It is a fairly precise measure of how far South Park had moved, or how far the surrounding culture had moved, or both. The commercial coda says something about how seriously the objection was taken. The day after the episode aired, South Park Studios put shirts and hooded sweatshirts on sale, featuring Butters standing in front of a motorcycle above a slogan playing on his line about wanting to join the riders. The episode had been condemned on a Thursday and merchandised on a Friday. The strongest case for the episode is the one it makes about language, and it is not a foolish case. Words do move. The dictionary sequence is accurate about the specific history it recounts, and taboo really is assigned by agreement rather than carried inside the letters. If enough people decide a word points somewhere else, it points somewhere else, and there are real examples of that happening in both directions within living memory. The episode's position is that fighting to bury a word is a losing strategy compared with redirecting it, and that the generation currently in elementary school will be the ones who actually decide the outcome regardless of what anybody older prefers. The strongest case against it is equally simple. A television program announcing a change is not the same as the change occurring, and in the interval between the announcement and the change, the word is still landing on the people it has always landed on. The episode contains the slur dozens of times, spoken by children, and every one of those instances reached an audience that included people for whom it had a specific and unpleasant history. The episode's own plot concedes the point, since Big Gay Al and Mr. Slave see the graffiti and are frightened by it, and they are frightened correctly because they had no way to know what was intended. Reviewers at the time also noted something else, which is that the episode is unusually preachy for this show. It spends long stretches on characters explaining the thesis to each other in council chambers and libraries, which is not a mode South Park is comfortable in. 6 years after that, the show did something completely different, and it did it by handing the decision to the audience. Tweak X Craig is the 6th episode of season 19 and the 263rd of the series. Parker wrote and directed this one as well, and it aired on October 28, 2015. Its origin is unusual enough to state precisely. A producer working on the video game South Park: The Fractured But Whole, Jason Schroeder, showed Parker and Stone a body of fan art he had found online in which two long-running background characters, Tweak and Craig Tucker, were depicted as a couple. This pairing had been a fixture of the show's fandom for years. Parker and Stone had not known it existed. Rather than making a joke at the expense of the people producing it, the show asked them to contribute. In the week before broadcast, South Park Studios publicly put out a call for fan artwork of the two characters, with a submission deadline of the Monday evening before the Wednesday airing. Pieces that came in were selected and used inside the finished episode. The webmaster handling the process noted afterward that receiving instructions from his employer to obtain that specific kind of art urgently had been a memorable experience. Inside the episode, the art is presented to the school in an assembly hosted by PC principal and Wendy Testaberger. Framed as an introduction to an art form the student body should understand and respect. Every image is of Tweak and Craig. The girls find it wonderful. The boys are alarmed, mostly because they can see where this is heading and would prefer not to be next. Tweak and Craig, who have never been a couple and have no particular interest in becoming one, watch the entire school conclude something about them that is not true. The town then takes over. A mural of the two of them appears on the outside of the school. Art gets sold in a market stall. The mayor keeps a picture in her office. Tweak's parents sit him down at dinner, tell him they already know and are proud of him, and his father is so pleased that he hands him cash. Craig's father, by contrast, cannot get there and spends the episode working through it before eventually arriving at acceptance for a relationship that may not exist. The two boys, cornered, come up with a plan. They will pretend to be a couple in public so that they can then publicly break up and put the whole thing to rest. The plan works works exactly as designed, right up to the point where the staged breakup happens, and both of them discover that it upset them more than it should have. They care about each other. Neither of them had noticed. And the episode ends with the two of them together, holding hands, with the show declining to specify whether what the audience is watching is a friendship repaired, a performance for the town's benefit, or something real. The ambiguity did not last. Later episodes treated them as a couple without qualification, and the creators confirmed it. Tweek and Craig have been together ever since, in the series and in the game that indirectly caused the episode, and they are now one of the most stable relationships anywhere in South Park. The construction of the episode is gentler than almost anything else in Season 19, which stands out given what that season was. Season 19 ran a single continuous story about a new headmaster whose entire personality was the aggressive policing of language, and it spent 13 years worth of accumulated argument on the question of what happens when the enforcement of decency becomes its own kind of bullying. This episode sits in the middle of that run, and it uses the season's machinery, with the assembly staged as a mandatory cultural education session, while pointing it at something considerably softer than the episodes around it. The music is a large part of why it works. The episode uses The Book of Love, performed by Peter Gabriel, over a montage of several boys lying awake in their beds at night, confused about everything, and it plays the sequence entirely straight. There is no undercutting gag. Later it reaches for Say Something by A Great Big World for the staged breakup, which is a piece of music so associated with sincere heartbreak that using it for a fake argument between two children should be a joke, and somehow is not. Both cues are chosen the way a drama would choose them, and both are allowed to run. Cartman spends the episode on a subplot of his own, involving a small winged version of himself who has taken an interest in him, which is exactly as strange as it sounds and functions as the episode's release valve. Every time the main story gets close to Ernest, the show cuts to Cartman having an increasingly uncomfortable time with a creature he summoned himself. It is the sort of structural safety net this show has always used when it is doing something sincere, and the fact that it needed one here says a good deal about how sincere the main plot actually is. The relationship between the show and its audience is the part of this that has no real precedent. Fan communities have been writing and drawing their own versions of characters for as long as there have been characters, and the traditional response from the people who own those characters has ranged from silence to legal threats. South Park's response was to look at what the fans had made, decide they had found something the writers had missed, put out an open call for more of it, print the results on screen, and then adopt the fans' idea as the official version. The pairing existed in the audience for years before it existed in the show. The episode is the moment the show caught up. What makes it worth putting at the end of this history is the reversal it represents. In 1997, the show built an episode around a town that could not cope with a gay dog, and the joke was aimed at the town. In 2015, the show built an episode around a town that decided two children were a couple, celebrated it enormously, monetized it, painted it on a wall, and left the two children with no socially acceptable way to say it was not true. The joke is still aimed at the town. What the town wants has completely inverted, and the show's position, which is that a crowd's enthusiasm is not the same thing as an individual's consent, has not moved at all. That is more or less the through line across every episode covered here. A dog at a bus stop in 1997. A man arguing with a hand puppet for 4 years. The devil learning to leave a bad relationship in a summer movie. A scoutmaster who won his case and refused the prize. A town that would rather send its children to a camp than admit a teacher had gone too far. A fad that borrowed everything and gave nothing back. A premiere that changed a main character for 3 years and started an argument that is still running. An egg carried through gunfire that legalized a marriage a decade before the country did. A 10-year-old at a conversion camp pointing out that he had been fine until the adults showed up. A word dragged through a dictionary. And two boys who were made a couple by public demand and turned out to want it anyway. Nearly 30 years, one small mountain town, and a show that has never once been willing to leave this subject alone. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.